One of the best moments in horror movies that do it right is when we're waiting for a jump scare to happen and it doesn't happen. It's the big moment before anything really appears, before the monster, before the loud music, and before the big reveal. It's the moment where the frame is empty and you're waiting for it not to be. The most terrifying thing in horror isn't what jumps out at us, it's the space where something should be. We're taught to believe that horror is what we see, but that's hardly ever true. Horror comes from anticipation, expectation, and the quiet agreement with the audience in the movie that something isn't right, even if it isn't visible yet. Horror doesn't live in what we're shown, it lives in what we're forced to believe. And today, we're going to talk about the horrors of the unseen. One thing the brain hates more than anything is uncertainty. When we're given incomplete information, our brain doesn't sit still. They search, they fill in their own gaps, and create their own shapes in the dark. That's why our brains create more personal threats than any filmmaker could. Because once something is seen, it's finite. It has edges, it has limitations and rules. The unseen doesn't. That's why suggestions last longer than the spectacle, and the implications lingers after the credits roll. Fear doesn't want answers, it wants possibilities. And when the audience understands that, horror movies no longer needs to rush. Because we're scared of something we can't see. And they know that. Restraint in horror is often misunderstood as hesitation, as if the story is not showing us its hand. In reality, restraint is confidence. When a filmmaker doesn't show you the threat, they're asserting a level of control over the audience's attention. They're saying, you will look where I tell you to look, and you will feel how I tell you to feel. In Jaws, the shark's absence isn't accidental, it transforms the ocean itself into a monster. Every shot of the water becomes suspicious, every calm surface feels temporary. The fear isn't tied to the shark's body, it's tied to the environment. Similarly, in the Blair Witch Project, the forest stops being a setting and becomes an entity. Not because it moves, but because it refuses to explain itself. The audience is never given relief through clarity, and without clarity, fear doesn't resolve, it accumulates. Sometimes the most powerful horror movies contain no monster at all, because the unseen isn't always supernatural. Sometimes it's emotional. Grief operates the same way as unseen does. It isn't defined by its presence, but by its absence. A voice that no longer answers, a room that feels altered, a routine that collapses without explanation. An example, in Lake Mungo, the horror comes from the realization that no revelation will ever make things whole. The ghost isn't frightening because it appears, it's frightening because it confirms that something has already been lost. In Hereditary, the unease is embedded in the family dynamic itself. Before any supernatural occurs, the film has already taught us that something is wrong. The unseen here is inevitability, a sense that events are moving forward whether the character understands them or not. Liminal spaces represent transition. There are places designed to be temporary, spaces meant to guide movement and not encourage stillness. Hallways, parking garages, hotels, schools after hours. These places feel unsettling when it's empty because they contradict their purpose. They imply human presence without confirming it. A liminal space feels haunted, not because something is there, but because something should be there. This aligns perfectly with unseen horror. The fear doesn't come from what's visible, it comes from what's missing. Empty spaces trigger the same psychological discomfort as unfinished thoughts. They feel unresolved. The liminal horror suggests a world that is slightly out of alignment, not broken, just abandoned. And abandonment is one of the deepest human fears. Liminal spaces resonate now because it mirrors modern society. We live between states constantly, between adolescence and adulthood, between online and offline, between presence and absence. Liminal spaces reflect emotional suspension. There are places where nothing happened, yet something feels imminent. The unseen in liminal horror is often not a monster. It's the fear that nothing is coming. That's the transition that leads nowhere. That's the space that is permanent, and empty malls, abandoned schools, and endless corridors. They suggest a future that quietly stopped, a world that moved on without us. The unseen works because it makes the audience complicit. When nothing is shown, the audience must force to imagine, and imagination is personal. Your unseen horror will always reflect you and your anxieties, your memories, and your losses. It belongs to the person watching and not entirely to the story. Audiences are conditioned to seek answers, and ambiguity feels uncomfortable. Silence feels empty, but that discomfort is the point. The unseen demands patience. It asks us to sit with unease without resolution. In a world full of constant stimulation, that can feel unbearable. But horror was never meant to be consumed quickly. It was meant to be carried. Horror doesn't need to prove itself. It doesn't need to show you everything to be effective, and sometimes the most terrifying thing a story can do is trust you. To turn off the lights, let your imagination continue to work, because fear doesn't end when the screen goes dark. It follows you into empty rooms, into quiet hallways, into spaces that feel wrong for reasons you can't explain. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing is knowing something is there, even when you can't see it.